All right, welcome back to the FITSNews studio, the first week in review of 2024. We are glad you are with us. A ton of stuff to cover. Obviously, the big news, Alex Murdaugh's retrial hearing. We're going to walk you through all the details for that upcoming evidentiary hearing, which will decide whether or not Alex Murdaugh, the convicted killer, scion of one of the most powerful legal dynasties in South Carolina, whether or not he will receive a new trial. We've also got an update on the saga involving Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill. Obviously, this has direct implications on Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. We're going to walk you through the very latest on the Becky Hill investigation. Also, we've got a story out of Chester County that's going to tug at your heartstrings, folks. Not only a horrific accident, but a family that has been waiting several months for justice in a tragic, fatal DUI that took place up there in Chester County. Our Andrew Fancher has put together an incredible story on that. Can't wait to walk you through all those details as we push for accountability and justice for this family. Last but not least, politics time, folks. We talked about the first in the South presidential primary, but the South Carolina General Assembly will convene this coming week in Columbia, South Carolina. We've talked extensively about warring factions within the ruling Republican Party here in South Carolina. We're going to walk you through the latest on that battle and sit down with one of the Freedom Caucus members who's in the middle of it. April Cromer, an interview with her. We got an excerpt. All that and more coming your way on the Week in Review. So obviously this week we are starting with the Murdaugh murders, crime and corruption saga, the retrial hearing for convicted killer Alex Murdaugh, which will determine whether or not he will receive a new trial on the murders of his wife, 52-year-old Maggie Murdaugh, and younger son, 22-year-old Paul Murdaugh. They were murdered June 7, 2021 down in Colleton County, South Carolina. Murdaugh was convicted of those murders last March after a 6-week trial in Walterboro, South Carolina. This case has been a shining example of everything that's right with South Carolina's badly broken justice system, or so we thought. So we thought. 6 months after those guilty verdicts were handed down, jury tampering allegations were leveled against Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill. Now, the state of South Carolina initially pushed back hard against those allegations, saying that Hill was a dedicated public servant who was the victim of a smear campaign. However, in the last few months, things have gone from bad to worse for Becky Hill. She's been embroiled in any number of scandals, and her allies been caught in a number of different lies, trying to keep all of the previous lies up to speed. That's the thing about a lie. When you tell one, you got to keep telling them, and Becky Hill and her allies have been caught in any number of them over the last few months. As you recall, just last month, we dropped thousands of emails, thousands of pages of emails even, from Becky Hill, her official account, which deepened this controversy and exposed allegations of plagiarism. So now Becky Hill's book, Behind the Doors of Justice, which was one of the things that is at the center of some ethics complaints against her, that book is now being pulled from the shelves because she has admitted to plagiarizing portions of the book. So just a disastrous few weeks for Becky Hill, and it leads into arguably the most critical moment in these proceedings, the evidentiary hearing, the retrial hearing, which will determine whether Murdaugh gets a new trial. So a lot happened this week on that front. We got some official notices about what's exactly to expect as we approach this hearing, and I wanted to talk just briefly about those logistical details. First, obviously, as we reported, the hearing will happen January 29. That's when it starts, Monday, January 29. They budgeted 3 days. Will it take 3 days? We don't know, but that's what's on the court calendar. Obviously, former Chief Justice Jean Toll will be presiding. Now, Toll was chosen by Chief Justice Donald Beatty after Clifton Newman, the circuit court judge who distinguished himself with his handling of the 6-week double homicide trial last year, recused himself. Now, Newman has recused himself due to the fact he may be a fact witness to some of these jury tampering allegations, and also because he had made some comments, again, comments I don't think anyone disagreed with, about Alex Murdaugh in the aftermath of his convictions. Now, those comments, while again not controversial, not getting any blowback from me, certainly, they did, however, indicate, a bias in this case that Newman clearly needed to stand aside and let another judge hear matters of fact related to Murdaugh's case. But as this case unfolds, as this story unfolds, we got two basic narratives that are being pushed. One of them coming from Alex Murdaugh's defense attorneys, Dick Harpootlian, Jim Griffin, Phil Barber, Maggie Fox. They filed a brief ahead of the evidentiary hearing arguing that the defense needs to prove only one thing, that Becky Hill tampered, that she had improper communications with jurors. According to them, if they can prove that, game over. Alex Murdaugh will get a new trial. Now, the state is arguing back a counterpoint, According to them, the standard is much higher. Not only does Murdaugh have to prove that tampering occurred, but that tampering actually forced jurors to rethink the way they were previously going to vote and vote to convict him. So in other words, not only did Becky Hill have to tamper, but it had to impact the verdict. So two very different standards. And here's the thing. We don't really have case law related to this specific set of circumstances. There's certainly case law about juries and jury tampering and even public officials, court officials tampering with the jury. There's a big case in South Carolina involving a bailiff that said something during jury deliberations that was allegedly improper. But we don't have case law regarding a clerk of court. By the way, the bailiffs, they work for the clerk of court. This is a much more influential position. But we are in uncharted ground here. And this week we sat down for the first of many interviews that we're going to be having with legal experts here in South Carolina and beyond, but experts who know these cases, who know these arguments, and who are going to bring a variety of cases, a variety of perspectives. One of the lawyers we sat down with, Lauren Taylor. Lauren's from right here in South Carolina. She's got offices all over the state. She does personal injury. She does family law. She does criminal defense. In fact, she got her start in criminal defense. Over a dozen years of experience. I sat down with Lauren this week to talk about this upcoming hearing. Here's an excerpt from that conversation.
Okay, we didn't get this exactly right. It's not everyone's fault.
Sure.
It's someone's fault, but it's not everyone's fault. Because, I mean, we've got to give it to Creighton Waters and all the time and effort that these people have put into this. Trials are exhausting to every core of your being. And so to have to do this again is not what anyone wants, but is it what justice requires? And I think it might be.
So Lauren's going to be on set with me a great deal over the coming weeks as we follow this story, and hopefully not only just sharing her insights and analysis, but also helping me as we host other experts who come on and share this conversation, host this conversation about this important hearing. But obviously, the big news this week, the scheduling of that evidentiary hearing for Alec Murdaugh's retrial and the presentation of those initial arguments about whether or not he should be granted a new trial. Now, obviously, this case is tied very closely to another case that we've been covering extensively for the last few months, and that is the saga of Becky Hill, the clerk of court, whose alleged tampering is why we're here, why we are talking about this retrial hearing. And it was another very difficult week for Becky Hill. I spoke earlier about all the scandals that have been tied to her, linked to her, the 2 ethics investigations, allegations of misappropriating money, about lying about those misappropriations, allegations about using her office to profit herself in the writing of this book, Behind the Doors of Justice, her proximity to a criminal wiretapping investigation involving her son, Colt Hill, the former IT director for Colleton County, who has since been fired after being arrested for tapping the phone of a fellow government employee, ostensibly to keep tabs on the investigation into his mother. Again, just horrific allegations against Becky Hill. And then, of course, the plagiarism allegations we talked about. But the jury tampering allegations are the one that really matter here. And as we've talked on this show on previous occasions, myself, Jen Wood, Dylan Nolan, we've had many discussions about how Becky Hill's credibility is going to be very crucial in determining whether or not Alec Murdaugh's request for a new trial is ultimately granted. I want to talk about that a little bit because this week, just yesterday, in fact, Friday, January the 5th, we published a big story on FITSNews which detailed some troubling revelations regarding the potential obstruction of justice allegations that have been leveled against Becky Hill and her son. And I'm referring, of course, to these things, the cell phones. Obviously, if you've watched the trial, the murder trial of Alec Murdaugh, it was the cell phones that provided the timelines, the detailed evidence of steps taken, of calls made, of location. All of that was critical in that circumstantial case against Alec Murdaugh. Because remember, there were no guns. There were no murder weapons. Those have never been found. No witnesses, living witnesses that we know of. So again, this was a case that was based on the circumstantial evidence, and that cell phone information was critical. But as we talk about these cell phones, as we look at this case moving forward, what about the cell phones of Becky Hill? Because we've been hearing a lot of discussion about that, a lot of people asking questions about that. We know that her emails, which have been released, her government emails, have painted her even further in a corner on some of these allegations against her. But what about the cell phone? What about Becky's cell phone during the trial? Well, guess what, folks? It's missing. That's right. Investigators don't know where that phone is. Hill turned in a phone, but it wasn't the phone that she used during the trial. And not only that, we have learned this week that 2 of the phones belonging to her son, Colt Hill, were actually destroyed. That's right, a personal phone and a county phone allegedly destroyed by Colt Hill during the course of this investigation. Also, 2 other phones, which Colt Hill handed over to investigators with the State Law Enforcement Division, were alleged to have been factory reset, basically an attempt to scrub them of all of their data. Now, whether or not that works, again, I don't know. I've never pulled in such hijinks on my phone, but we're going to dig into some of this now. I want to talk a little more about these phones because basically we're talking about 6 devices. 2 phones originally belonging to Colt Hill, one of them a government phone, one of them a personal phone, allegedly destroyed. 2 of them allegedly set back to factory settings in an attempt to hide data. Then we've got the 1 phone that Becky Hill used during the trial, which no one can seem to find. And then one phone that Becky Hill did turn over to law enforcement that's apparently at the center of a big debate, but we're not sure what information is on it. We're not even sure if it's the phone Becky Hill was using as these allegations became public. But I want to walk through some of the timing here because it's very problematic. We know from our previous reporting that in late July, as the ethics investigation into Becky Hill was beginning to ramp up, we know that her son has been accused of recording a Colleton County official named Megan Utze. We know this because this is in the arrest warrant for Colt Hill, who has been charged with criminal wiretapping. But as this case was unfolding, and as these walls were starting to close in on the Hill family, we started learning that some interesting moves were made. For example, one of the phones that was destroyed, this took place right at the moment that we believe the Hills found out that they had been busted, that they found out that Mrs. Utze knew that they were recording her. And in fact, it was right before Colt Hill was suspended from his job. Now, you'll recall Jeffrey Hill was suspended on July 27 of 2023. That was one day after the request he made to get his mother's phone line switched from the county to her personal use was approved. So he destroys his phone and he switches his mom's phone line on that date. We also know that on September 5th, on or about September 5th, which is the day Becky Hill was first accused of jury tampering, we now know that that is when the Samsung phone that has been sought by investigators, the phone that Becky Hill used during the trial, a county phone, which again had been switched from her government use to personal use, that is when that phone is alleged to have disappeared. Sounds like a Hillary Clinton scandal, doesn't it? Destroying phones, bleaching phones. We don't know they bleached them, but these are red flags. Any way you look at it. Destroying phones, scrubbing phones, these are red flags. These are indicators of people with something to hide. And once again, it is just another erosion of Becky Hill's credibility, which again is so important to the state of South Carolina. As I mentioned earlier, the state held her up as a devoted public servant who was being unfairly attacked by attorneys for Alex Murdaugh. Well, guess what, folks? It is not looking like that's the case. And that's very tough for me to say because, again, Becky Hill is somebody everybody came to know and love during this trial. We talked about it last episode with myself and Jim Wood. We talked about it on multiple episodes. This was a friend, someone we all trusted. But now we are seeing a different side of Becky Hill as the, again, investigative scrutiny bears down upon her. Now, speaking of that scrutiny, I want to talk real quickly about SLED, the investigative agency that investigated Alex Murdaugh's double homicide, all the Murdaugh investigations, and the investigation that, against the advice of many, is leading the jury tampering probe. Now, this is significant, and I want to talk about this because I, at the time, expressed reservations about whether or not SLED should be in charge of this inquiry. I argued that they have a vested interest in the verdicts that were handed down, being that they were the lead investigative agency on the murders, and that they should probably refer this to another agency. Some said federal, others said that, hey, give it to another county. Let them come in and investigate these jury tampering allegations. But the problem that I identified months ago, the specter of impropriety, potential impropriety on the part of law enforcement, we're getting some troubling reports about that, folks. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail yet because we're still digging, but we have been able to confirm that in the early phases of the investigation into the wiretapping of Colt Hill's government associate there down in Colleton, which he has since been arrested on, we have been able to confirm that in the early stages of that investigation, there were attempts to minimize the connection of that investigation to Becky Hill, when in fact, the purpose of the wiretapping, the very reason that the phone was tapped, was to find out the very latest on the investigation into Becky Hill. And we know this because our sources in Walterboro who've been talking to Colt Hill have told us. He's telling everyone, I did this for my mom. It's unfair. I'm the only one in trouble now. That is a huge red flag. Again, destroyed phones, scrubbed phones, the timeline that matters, and these lies that are being told. It adds up to serious problems for the state of South Carolina, and it could, emphasis on could, be the scandal that results in Alec Murdaugh receiving a new trial. For the very latest on the Becky Hill investigation, for the very latest on the Murdaugh retrial hearing, keep it tuned to FITSNews.com. So for this segment, we're actually speaking with the reporter who broke the Colt Hill component of that big Becky Hill saga that we've been following, Andy Fancher. Andy, we're talking now, though, about a story out of Chester County, just a horrific crash, a fatal DUI. Walk us through the story that you've been covering. I know it's been covered by some mainstream media already, but nobody has dug into it the way you have. Walk us through what happened up in Chester.
Yeah, absolutely right. We've pretty much been on this story since it was initially broken by some outlets to a very vague degree. We've been speaking with attorneys as well as several members of this family, and as you said, it's horrific. I mean, it's atrocious. It's graphic. We have a dead 25-year-old pregnant woman who was 6 months pregnant with her son at the time, while her two younger children, a 3-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl, were in the back seat. The car essentially folded like an accordion when it was struck by what we believe is a drunk driver who has yet to be charged.
Yet to be charged, and that's the component of this. You talk about this family waiting for justice. This happened in October. We're now in January of 2024. But Andy, let's just take a look. You put together an amazing package on this incident. Let's roll that.
How could she possibly be dead? She was just here.
Why the wait? That's the question Sandra Potter poses to the state now 10 weeks after her daughter and unborn grandson were killed by a driver who supposedly admitted he was drunk. But rather than any criminal punishment for his actions, the South Carolina businessman seemingly responsible for this tragedy was sent to rehab before enjoying Christmas with his family.
Everybody was devastated because you just don't think something like that's going to happen to a 25-year-old taking her kids to buy Christmas lights.
Sandra Potter is clinging to the memories of her 25-year-old daughter, who left the family home at approximately 3 o'clock on October 25th to go Christmas shopping with her children. Caitlin Marie Potter was 6 months pregnant when a sports car struck her Nissan Sentra in a head-on collision while traveling northbound on Highway 72 near Chester. A graphic Snapchat video captured within minutes of her death.
So we drove to the wreck, not knowing that Caitlin was still in the car dead. And the coroner come over and told me that she hadn't survived. And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said she didn't make it.
Caitlin and her unborn child, Maverick Branson Baker, were pronounced dead by the Chester County coroner within minutes. Her 3-year-old son, Jameson, and 5-year-old daughter, Natalie, were airlifted to Levine Children's Hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina.
And of course, my granddaughter saw her mother get killed. She could even tell you how the car did, how the other car did, what was going on, that the other car burnt. I mean, she could tell you everything.
While Natalie suffered only a broken arm, her little brother remains in the hospital with a fractured skull, limited motor skills, and years of intense physical therapy ahead. According to Sandra, her grandson is quasi-conscious after 3 surgeries, but limited to a wheelchair and helmet when he's not confined to a hospital bed.
It's awful. It's awful. Because he was here every day. And he would run and fall on purpose, and then he'd get up and go, telling us he was okay. He would love jumping off of stuff. I'd have to get onto him all the time because he would get on the back of this couch and jump off.
According to attorneys, the man responsible for this tragedy is Charles Sidney Jones III, owner and operator of Reef Pavers Construction in Florida. He was purportedly rounding the highway at approximately 100 miles per hour when he struck a pickup truck, swerved into oncoming traffic, and pulverized Caitlin's car. This is where a seemingly clear-cut case of vehicular homicide takes a detour.
I mean, we just know that an alleged drunk driver hit him. Of course, we've been more involved with Caitlin's death and Maverick's and then all of the injuries and stuff, but we really hadn't been told a whole lot from the highway patrol or anybody about who hit her.
Unbeknownst to the Potter family, Jones had not only survived the wreck he allegedly caused, but was released from the hospital within hours of his arrival. He purportedly went on to celebrate Halloween and Thanksgiving within the confines of rehab and was released from treatment sometime before Christmas. All the while, friends and family of Caitlin Potter wait for rectification.
We want justice for Caitlin. We want justice for Maverick and for Bubba and for Natalie. Those 2 kids have got to grow up without a mama now. They'll never be able to go hug her again. They'll never be able to give her kisses. She'll never get to see them graduate or get married or have kids because somebody wanted to drink.
Attorneys familiar with this tragedy say Jones is scheduled to surrender himself to authorities and appear in bond court on Monday, January 8th. But until that time, it appears as though the man with 2 previous DUIs and a reckless driving charge will remain unpunished for killing a pregnant woman and injuring her children. For FITSNews.com, I'm Andrew Fancher.
I mean, Andy, that is unbelievable. I mean, now let me ask you this: the guy in that video in the middle of the road, that's the driver of the car that struck the Nissan? That's the alleged drunk driver?
That is correct. So the fellow that we see sprawled out in the middle of the road is Charles Sidney Jones III, known on his business pages as Trey. It appears that he was thrown from that BMW convertible he was driving, which come to find out is his father's car. We do know that he sustained some injuries, obviously, after being thrown from the car, but apparently nothing too damaging that he couldn't leave the hospital within hours, which is what happened.
But obviously nothing like those graphic injuries sustained by the victims in this case, and obviously the fatalities here. Andy, do we have no indication of possible charges coming against Jones? I mean, that's October. Here we are in January.
Right. I mean, here we are 10 weeks later at the time of our recording, approximately 2.3 months since this crime occurred. And I'm glad you brought this up because I just got off the phone with an attorney familiar with the situation who says that the Chester solicitor, or the Chester solicitor's office, saw to it that this man appear not in magistrate court, but circuit court this coming Monday, January 8th, where we will be there.
So hopefully we will finally get some, at least initial stages of accountability here. And obviously everyone presumed innocent until proven guilty, but just what a horrific, not only tragedy for this family to endure, but this waiting game that you talked about, just awful, having to sit with this for so long, waiting on some justice. Andy, unbelievable work, man. And we look forward to you bringing this home and telling us exactly what goes down up in Chester come Monday. So one of the big storylines at the South Carolina State House last year was an ongoing battle between fiscally conservative, socially conservative members of the Freedom Caucus and members of the establishment Republican caucus, who actually kicked those conservatives out of their caucus. Why? because they wouldn't sign a loyalty oath and pledge not to oppose some of these liberal Republicans in future elections. Now, those elections are now upon us. It is 2024. It is an election year. And so the skirmishes we saw in 2023 between these dueling factions of the GOP are now spilling out into the open. It is going to be open warfare between the Freedom Caucus and the Republican establishment as a host of ideological battles are set to unfold in state government here in South Carolina. Now, we've spoken to numerous lawmakers on different sides of these debates. Last week, in fact, we spoke with Joe White, one of the lawmakers who's been very aggressive in pushing judicial reform. But this week, we sat down with April Cromer. Now, she's another member of the Freedom Caucus. She's worked with Joe White on a host of different reforms. As we get prepared for the big session of the General Assembly set to convene next week in Columbia, South Carolina, we thought it was worth sitting down with April Cromer and getting her perspective on the battle to come. Your colleagues stood up to some of those leaders early in the session. You were presented with a loyalty oath, I believe it's been called, whereby if you endorsed someone against an incumbent Republican, even if it's a friend or business associate, someone you've known your whole life, they threatened to kick you out of the caucus. And in fact, when you guys wouldn't sign that, many of you got kicked out of the caucus. Walk us through the current dynamic between the Freedom Caucus and the Republican leadership in the House.
Yeah, I think that was very surprising to me. Always been a Republican in our area, doing what we could, supporting what we thought were conservative candidates. And then to go into the Republican caucus, and most of the things I didn't have an issue with. Any of them, except for Rule 16, which said you can't campaign against others. And that just kind of blew my mind. What do you mean? I mean, if you vote how you campaign, if you're the same person in Columbia as you are in your district, what do you have to worry about? What do you have to hide? So that was very shocking in South Carolina to be the only state to do that. So I would never sign that. I would never go in someone's district and lie about them. But if I'm asked questions, I'm going to answer it, which I would expect the same to be about me. Accountability and transparency is so important. We're not there for ourselves or for our friends in chamber, and we need to remember that, and I will die by that.
Well, I know you and Representative White and so many of your colleagues in the Freedom Caucus aren't there. Unfortunately, I don't know that we can say the same for a lot of the establishment politicians you guys are fighting against. But let me ask you this. Looking past that Freedom Caucus establishment fight, obviously that's going to be a big deal on the campaign trail during the primary elections coming up in June. You guys have a bunch of folks poised to run. Is that correct?
Yeah, hope so.
Okay, and then obviously the establishment trying to take a few of you out. Have you been targeted?
No one, I mean, I suspect. I know people have been offered over $50,000 to run against me. The flyers have been sent out against me that were not truthful. So, yeah, I think they're searching, but I think competition is a good thing. And if there are good candidates out there, I'm going to support them. I'm going to donate money to them. I'll do whatever I can to change the fabric of South Carolina for good candidates, not just for the sake of throwing somebody's name on a ballot. But I encourage anyone to just take a look and see if now is the time for you to step up in some way and run. I think the people need to be represented by their elected official. I don't see that. And I would encourage others to realize all levels of government, how it affects you and your family, and get involved and make sure that your voice is being heard. I don't think that's happening. Because right now it's the
special interest voices more often than not.
Yeah, that's what it seems. Like you said, with the Scout deal, even in Anderson, we had a meeting recently. We were discussing the roads, and they said they can't get contractors or companies because they're busy with Scout. So it's affecting so many different facets of the area, and weaponization of economic development in our state. I think that is a huge problem.
Not to mention the fact that those individual taxpayers have got to pay the $1.3 billion that we're giving away to them. So it's a double hit. Let me ask you this question. How important in this debate is school choice? If we can get to a system where you talked about competition earlier electorally, Where are you on school choice and competition academically?
Well, yeah, even in our business, we'll tell our competitors make you work harder. It makes you do a better job. School choice is the same. We have amazing teachers, but of course, they're expected to do everything but teach now. And the pressure from your district offices, from the principal, it should be, the principal-teacher relationship that are making these decisions. The needs of every student is not being met. The taxpayers are paying the dollars, but the schools are failing. And so school choice is important, that the parents have the choice to decide what's best for their kids and to meet those needs. And if they're not being met, they need to have the option to put them wherever they need, because it's their dollars that are being spent and their kids aren't benefiting from it. It's a shame that most of the kids in our state can't read on grade level, 3rd, 5th grade level. So I think it's definitely failing, and we need to get very creative very quickly, because you can bring in Scout Motors that says they're going to have all these jobs, high-paying jobs, but if the residents can't read on a 5th grade level, those jobs are not going to come from the area. And that's where my focus would be with the main problem, and how do we fix that so that these kids can grow up, have critical thinking skills, and be able to decide on their own what they want to be and where they want to go.
All right, thanks to April for joining us. To watch that full interview, keep it tuned to FITSNews.com. Also want to thank Andy Fancher for his reporting on that tragic DUI accident in Chester County. We'll keep you up to speed next week as we learn more about the disposition of that case. Thanks to everybody for tuning in to this week's edition of the Week in Review. We will catch you next time.